Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on a 5-day program on the inner work of age. One of the demographic facts about the United States, Canada, most of Europe, Russia, Japan, is that our populations are aging. It's an extraordinary situation in the world where most of the world is getting younger. Something like 60% of the entire global population is under 25 years old. You think of India with 1.2 billion people. Nearly 700 million of them are under 25. And yet in the areas that I've mentioned in North America, Europe, Russia, Japan, the populations are aging. So we have this discontinuity in the global population. But it's an important issue to take into consideration as populations age, because values are shaped by our maturity, cultural norms, political efficacy. And so the issue of aging, which we're going to delve into this week, is a profoundly important one, particularly in a culture that honors youth and doesn't honor the aging process, which is also true of the United States and Europe in particular. So there are many issues, many currents, many layers to consider when we think of maturation and we think of aging, and the question of how our aging shapes us in such fundamental ways, and therefore how our spiritual vitality is both shaped by aging, and we consciously can shape the spirituality of our aging process at the same time. So that's our domain of inquiry for the next 5 days, and it's very exciting. Before we dive into the program, however, let us just take a moment to center ourselves, as we always do at the beginning of our Humanity Rising sessions, through some coherent breathing. So in a moment, Georg is going to put up another art card. You'll see a 5-pointed flower, 5-pointed star. And as you gaze at it, just know that that's the picture of what the combined orbits of the Earth and Venus make as they circumambulate the sun. They form a 5-pointed star. And this is important because the number of Venus is 5, the number of many of the ancient goddesses in antiquity. Aphrodite, Ishtar was the number 5. And science has discovered that if you breathe slowly in to the count of 5, exactly 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out, that coherent breathing optimizes your entire body more quickly and more effectively than any other single thing that you can do. So when we breathe together, we're breathing in a way that optimizes all of our body systems, our coherence between our heart and our brains, equalizing our emotions, but also producing increased acuity in our intellect, all at the same time. And so that's our gift to our global community. So Georg, if you'll tee us up, we'll do it for 10 breaths, and then we'll begin our program. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. It's always good to breathe together. Plotinus, the very ancient Greek philosopher 2,500 years ago, said the whole universe breathes together. So in that spirit, I would like to welcome my good friend and colleague, Connie Zweig, who's a Jungian therapist, now retired, has a PhD, and has written a number of best-selling works. She's been a specialist in shadow work for as long as at least I've known her, and a number of books, and more recently been developing the notion of the shadow in midlife and also in the aging process, and has observed that the way we age affects how we understand and deal with our shadow. And her recent bestseller has been on shifting from role to soul, particularly as we age. So Connie, I want to thank you for convening this 5-day program. Connie just completed an extraordinary course for Ubiquity University on the shadow and turning it into gold. That was extremely well received. So Connie, I just want to acknowledge your mastery as a teacher, and thank you for being part of this program for Humanity Rising. And I turn the program over to you with many thanks. Need to unmute.
A deep bow of gratitude to you, and also to Georg behind the scenes, all the wizards behind the curtain. Thank you for this opportunity. Much, much appreciated. So my book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends my body of work on the shadow, or the personal unconscious, into life after midlife for people who are over 50 and want to continue their emotional and spiritual development alongside their continued longevity. All the spiritual traditions teach us that later life is about reconciliation, contemplation, distilling the lessons we've learned, and finding a spiritual practice to move beyond ego and connect with something greater than our individual needs and desires. And if we do this inner work of age, we cross a threshold to become elders. But what I found in my late 60s is that there are no rites of passage to guide us to release the past and become elders, to shift our identities from role, from what we do, to soul, or who we really are. And that's what led me to write this book and create this week. And this week offers you a rite of passage. We're going to uncover the unconscious denial we carry about aging, which I call the inner ageist. We're going to hear from leaders of conscious aging organizations who are elder activists, and they're going to offer you invitations to join them in contributing to the common good. We're going to reframe retirement as a sacred call to expand our awareness from role to soul. And with renowned elders, we're going to reimagine the nobility of the elder archetype in this moment, this particular cultural moment in which we're living. And we're going to learn about contemplative practices on day 5 from well-known spiritual elders of diverse traditions. So during our 5 days together, we're going to create this missing rite of passage to transition from senior to elder and emerge renewed with a mission to give the gift that only we can give. Today, we're going to start with ageism from the inside out and from the outside in. So if we identify with youth and deny age, if we strive to appear young and busy while denying our inner world, then we're unaware of our ageism against ourselves. And we unknowingly support institutional ageism in the culture. And research now demonstrates the devastating consequences of this internalized ageism for our self-acceptance, our physical health, brain health, longevity, and our capacity to find fulfillment in this stage of life. So I want to begin by introducing my colleague, Ashton Applewhite. She's the #1 anti-ageism crusader in the world right now and is finally being recognized in that way. She's the author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism. She's co-founder of Old School, Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse, which is a great online resource for all kinds of topics related to ageism. She speaks at venues that include TED and the UN, has written for Harper's, The Guardian, the New York Times, and she's the voice of Yo, Is This Ageist? The most recent accolade Ashton has received is from the Decade of Healthy Aging, which is a collaboration of the United Nations and the World Health Organization. And it named her one of the Healthy Aging 50 leaders transforming the world to be a better place to grow older. Congrats, Ashton, that's so fabulous. So she's going to begin now with our topic, ageism from the outside in.
Thank you, Connie. It is thrilling to be here with you, and I am delighted to meet your audience and for this opportunity. So thank you. Let's start with where the rubber hits the road, the word old. How does that make you feel? It used to make me feel something between like apprehension and dread. What was my darkest fear? Ending up in some grim institutional hallway. And then I learned that the percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes is only 2.5%, and it's dropping. What else was I worried about? Dementia. Alzheimer's is a terrible disease, but it is not typical of aging. 90% of us will think just fine to the end. That's a statistic from the Alzheimer's Association. And dementia rates are falling. The likelihood of anyone listening to me getting diagnosed with Alzheimer's has gotten lower and lower, and people are being diagnosed at later ages. Sometimes I think of myself as being in the both sides of the story business. It's not that the scary things are not real. It's that our fears are so out of proportion to reality. And as Connie mentioned, the health implications already, our fears make us more vulnerable to exactly what we fear. I also assumed that old people were depressed because they were old and they were going to die soon. And it turns out that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-curve of happiness, and it has been borne out by dozens of studies around the world. I just saw it in October's Harper's Magazine Index, the point at which American adults are least satisfied with their lives, age 48. It gets better. And best of all, you don't have to be a Buddhist or a billionaire, although probably helps, the Buddhist part. The curve is a function of the way aging itself affects the brain. So I started feeling a lot better about the years ahead, and I started obsessing about why so few people know these things. And the reason is ageism, stereotyping, discrimination on the basis of age. Of course, stereotyping is always misguided, but especially when it comes to age, because the older we get, the more different from one another we become. We experience ageism anytime someone assumes that we are too old. No such thing, right? There's always something else other than age behind it. Instead of finding out who we are, what we're capable of, or too young. Ageism cuts both ways, and young people experience a lot of it too. It is any judgment about someone or a group of people on the basis of how old we think they are. Nobody's born ageist, but it starts in early childhood, around the same time that attitudes towards race and gender start to form. Prejudice is learned. And in this culture, negative messages about age and capacity come at us from the media, popular culture at every turn, starting with children's books. And we olders can be the most ageist of all because we've had a lifetime of absorbing those messages without realizing it, right? Most bias is unconscious, and we've never thought to question them. And when prejudice gets a pass, the way ageism has until pretty recently, it seems normal, just the way things are. And unless we challenge the underlying message that to age is to lose value as a human being, it's that ugly and basic. It becomes part of our identity. That's the internalized ageism that Connie referred to. And this is where our inner work, the reason we're here this morning to discuss, that's where our inner work around ageism belongs. It's not aging that's the problem. The problem is discrimination. It's not being women that makes life harder for women. It's sexism. It's not loving a man that makes life harder for gay guys. It's homophobia. And it is not the passage of time that makes growing older so much harder than it has to be. It is ageism. When labels are hard to read, or we can't open the damn jar, or there's no railing, we tend to think I should be more limber, better prepared, maybe even I should stay home. We tend to blame ourselves instead of blaming the ageism that makes those natural transitions shameful and the discrimination that makes those barriers acceptable. And that discrimination harms us all individually and collectively in countless ways that we are just starting to become aware of. I'm going to list a couple of those domains. One is the workforce. Obviously, longer lives require working longer and saving more, and yet at least 2/3 of American workers report encountering age discrimination or witnessing it, even though there's a global labor shortage. Not one stereotype about older workers holds up under scrutiny. And just like race and gender, age is a criterion for diversity in the workplace and everywhere else. Ageism harms our health. In medicine, it means less treatment, worse treatment, often no treatment at all for older people. And I'm always urging people to zoom out and look at the structural issues and ask the big questions. In this case, why should we accept a different standard of care for older people? That is institutional ageism at work. Internalized ageism matters too, a lot, as we'll hear about from Connie. A growing body of fascinating research shows that people with more accurate feelings about aging, I don't like to frame it as positive feelings about aging because that seems sort of like happy talk. People with fact rather than fear-based attitudes walk faster, heal quicker, live longer. And ageism affects cognition too. Most of this research is done by Becca Levy at Yale, who has a fantastic new book out called Breaking the Age Code. And one of her studies shows that people who associate old age with growth and purpose are less likely to develop Alzheimer's, even if they're genetically predisposed to the disease. And it's also why the World Health Organization, as we've already touched on, population aging is a global permanent demographic trend. And the World Health Organization, not the World Old People Organization, realized that the biggest obstacle to extending health span along with lifespan was ageism. And that's why they launched a global campaign to combat ageism a year ago. Not news to any of you, I suspect, that ageism disproportionately affects women because we face the double whammy of ageism and sexism. So we experience aging differently. We women reinforce this double standard of aging being different for women, devaluing us, whereas it enhances men up to a point. We reinforce this negative message when we compete to stay young, punishing, impossible, expensive proposition. And the effects add up over time. And as is always the case, they are further compounded by race and by class, which is why the poorest of the poor, sickest of the sick, everywhere in the world are old women of color. Ageism segregates us. Feeling alienated from older people and apprehensive at joining us in aging is not natural. It's not inevitable. These values are socially constructed, which is a fancy way of saying we make them up and we can unmake them and make new ones. Age segregation cuts us off from most of humanity. So I want to be clear that we face an extraordinary opportunity right now. In our lifetimes, for the first time in human history, 4 and even 5 living generations became commonplace. The last time this happened was in the Paleolithic era, when our hominid ancestors evolved to enable a 3rd living generation. And that's when art emerged. That's when music happened. And the roles and institutions around us were created when lives were shorter. And they have yet to catch up So we have a critical window of opportunity to tap into the millions of healthy, well-educated adults, many more, by multiples of, hundreds, thousands than ever before, and shape a world that supports people of all ages across these longer lifespans. So how do we get there? Couple of ideas. Tap into what we know, what I have a feeling most of the people who are with us today know. Aging enriches us. Growing older isn't just different from what we've been brainwashed to believe, it is way better. Again, it's not that the losses aren't real, but aging confers confidence, perspective, self-awareness. That's why I can't say I've never met anyone, but not very many people who actually want to go back to their youth. No swapping out just the battered bits, because no matter how apprehensive we may be, we know that our years are what make us us. Secondly, learn to look more generously at each other and at ourselves. Entire industries are built on convincing people that my 70-year-old face and body are hideous, that old equals ugly, especially for women. But a system designed to exploit our insecurities only works if we agree to it. Instead of muttering, "What the hell happened?" at the face in the mirror, and we all have those mornings, no judgment, how about taking a minute to recall some of the things that did happen and how amazing they were? Let's not delude ourselves. This is the work of a lifetime. We need to embark on it with others and with all ages. That's super important. But none of this stigma is natural and none of it is fixed. We can insist on being seen and being valued as our full, rich, lumpy, wrinkly, complicated selves and take that change out into the world. And I bet you all know that when we feel differently about ourselves, we're different. We change the energy around us. The slightest change is important, right? It has ramifications. Also, ask for help. Autonomy requires collaborators. I love that quote from Dutch gerontologist Jan Bars. No one is independent ever. I would like to take the word independence out of the whole aging discourse. We're social creatures. All of life is interdependence, and asking for help is a two-way, mutually gratifying transaction. So let's work on acknowledging the need for helping hands lifelong. We all need help, not just when we're older, although we need more help because physical capacity diminishes, and reach for those hands gratefully and without shame. Make friends of all ages. If you don't know people much older or younger than you, think of something you like to do and find a mixed age group to do it with. Try not to stay home just because you'll stick out. Even one habit to work on breaking is making a beeline for people our own age when we enter the room. We all do that, but that's how desegregation happens. And open-minded people welcome us. And that's how incremental social change takes place. And of course, this benefits younger people too, because otherwise they have to figure out on their own just how dumb and destructive it is to fear growing older and how much of our youth we waste on worrying about it. And last but not least, join forces. Dismantling ageism will require nothing less than a mass movement, like the 20th century movement that catalyzed a mass shift of consciousness and raised voice and awareness for women around the world. We need a grassroots movement to raise awareness of ageism in the same way that I'm now happy to say that movement is underway around the world. For evidence, check out the Old School Clearinghouse. Thanks for the shout out, Connie. oldschool.info, which is a clearinghouse of free vetted resources. Everything is free except the books. And when we launched it in 2018, we didn't even have a campaign section. And now it's one of our fastest growing sections, although you'll find webinars and graphics and all kinds of stuff that to fit you and whatever your interests are. Changing the culture is a tall order, but culture is fluid. Look at how far we've come on gay and trans rights, for example, in just a few decades. Until we put a stop to it, ageism is going to oppress us all. But here's the thing. None of this happens. We won't create the rites of passage that Connie just spoke about so eloquently and writes about without the inner work that she is going to tell us about. Because we can't challenge bias until we're aware of it, and because all change starts within. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashton. That was really beautiful and powerful. So I want to introduce Rick Moody, who's on the screen. And after I respond to Ashton, Rick is going to moderate for us our conversation. So Rick is a mentor and friend to me. He's the former vice president of AARP, executive director of Brookdale Center on Aging at Hunter College, chairman of the board of Elder Hostel, which is now Rhodes Scholar. He's visiting faculty at Fielding Graduate Institute, editor of Human Values in Aging newsletter, which comes monthly and is a wonderful resource. And Rick, maybe you want to put a link in the chat for how to sign up for the newsletter. He's co-author of the textbook Aging, Concepts and Controversies, and he's author of the 5 Stages of the Soul. And I'm really excited that his forthcoming book is called Climate Change in an Aging Society. So he's going to link this new longevity that we're talking about today with the climate crisis. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes and then we're going to have a conversation. And Ashton, you could put the link for Old School also in the chat so people can get on your list. So Ashton gave us a really sweeping framework, as I knew she would, to see how collective ageism is the soup in which we swim. And her advocacy through her book and lectures and website is so crucial to our age justice movement. But I want to flip the picture for a moment as a depth psychologist. And I want to suggest that we need to examine not only ageism from the outside in, but from the inside out, which is now known as internalized ageism. And like racism, it can't be legislated away. That's because it's primarily unconscious, outside of our awareness, residing in what we call the shadow. And this unconscious shadow in all of us carries any trait or feeling or behavior that was forbidden and repressed in us in childhood. So if our sadness is shamed, it's exiled into our shadow. If our anger is punished, it's banished too, and it becomes difficult to express it later in life. If our musical or artistic talent is devalued, it gets buried in the shadow. And because it's beneath the threshold of awareness, it's like a blind spot in our vision. But the shadow erupts from time to time. It may erupt in rage or addiction or depression. And it erupts in projections, such as ageism, racism, and homophobia. So what's in the shadow in the context of age? Ashton made a wonderful point about independence. We learn that being independent, quick, productive, and strong are highly valued, and they result in rewards. And on the other hand, we learn that dependent, slow, unproductive, and weak result in disapproval and shame. And so we dread the loss of these socially acceptable traits as we age and slow down and do less and need others more. And the result is that we project onto others stereotypes about being old, over the hill, greedy geezers, senile, and so on. And we turn that target of projection then onto ourselves, rejecting our changing appearance, our emotional needs, our physical limitations. And I call this part of our shadow the inner ageist, the part of us that wants to remain young and deny age at all costs. Like my 89-year-old friend who said he doesn't want to be with those old people because he's not like them. So let me tell you a quick story before we go into conversation about a famous California potter named Beatrice Wood, who wrote about meeting her inner ageist. She said, "I've always hated old people. And then I had to go to the hospital, and I found myself in a room with a toothless old lady, and she wouldn't let me rest. I was not nice to her till I realized that she needed someone. She had had a heart attack and she was alone and scared. And I whipped myself into decency. And I told her I'd speak to the doctor and I'd call her every day. And when I sat on her bed and really looked at her, this old woman became beautiful. And there was no wall between us. I called her the next day and she had died, but she died knowing that somebody cared about her. And now you see the arrogance of the artist who didn't want to be disturbed by an old lady. And I threw that into the ash can and I met another human being. And this was one of the greatest lessons in my life." End quote. So my chapter on the inner ageist will guide you to discover whether this hidden part of yourself is leading you to denial, self-rejection, and projection onto others, hurtful projection. Ashton mentioned that this research from Yale University has shown when we internalize this inner ageist throughout the lifespan, when we believe that aging makes us worthless and useless and unattractive, we strive to remain young. And our brains, minds, and bodies are deeply shaped by that. And this negative image of old within us affects even our longevity. But when we make the inner ageist conscious and we do shadow work to change it, we can find deeper self-acceptance, authenticity, and purpose. And we can step into the elder archetype and model a new kind of aging for others. So thank you for listening to us. And now we want to have a conversation among us. And Rick is going to help us moderate that with his wonderful lifelong experience in the world of conscious aging.
The hat says, what does it say? I forgot. Aging is the only way to live. I took this, I wore this the other day when I took my two granddaughters, age 4 and 6, to the circus in Redwood City, near where I live. And as I was watching the circus, I was thinking, how do they see this? Because they're seeing it with new eyes. And so seeing it through their eyes, and it helped me see it in a new way. But I'll take off my hat if you don't mind, just for a second. I want to say something because I realized that in this group of 3 people, the 2 ladies and me, I am the Y chromosome. So I have to represent the Y chromosome perspective. And there's a question, why are there 6 million sperm but only 1 egg? And the answer, the sperm won't ask for directions. And this is a big problem because men have 2 problems. Number one, we frequently don't ask for directions. We explain, mansplaining, whatever you want to call it. But second, we're not going to live collectively on average as long as the other 2 people in this presentation, okay? Now, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, but still, it's important to think about that and to think about mortality. And I'm 77 years old. So I'm, in addition to being the Y chromosome, I'm also the elder in this group. And you got to understand how bizarre that seems to me, because I have spent 50 years working in the field of aging since I started when I was 27, do the math, teaching in senior centers and got interested in this. And one thing led to another. And pretty soon I found myself, gee, I wrote a textbook, blah, blah. Did I do all these things? I got to tell you, Connie, when you gave that description of me, I got tired just listening to it, thinking, oh my God, is this the real Rick Moody? I worry about this because, how can I put it? My old friend Dave Eckert wrote a great essay about 40 years ago about aging called The Busy Ethic. The Busy Ethic. And when I read it, it reminded me of the years, and I was on the board of Elder Hostel. I was chairman of the board and so forth. Excuse me, my phone is ringing. Somebody's interrupting me. No, this is when I thought the meeting was going to happen today. Anyway, we used to give out pins, tokens, and so forth to elder hostelers. If you went on 5, you got 1. If you went on 10, you got a. So people collected these things. They had a kind of elder. It was called Elder Hostel in those days. That's when we wanted to use the name Elder Hostel. Eventually, we decided, oh, that name has too many bad connotations. Did you hear that, Ashton? Bad connotations. Okay, so even Elder Hostel, the most successful, biggest education travel program in the world, right up there with National Geographic, decided we got to change the name. This is after I left the board. I can't be guilty of that. But why'd they do that? Why'd they give out these passports? Because people want to collect a token that said, I've gone to so many elder hostels. What a good person I am. This is the busy ethic. And here, what I want to do is, because I'm the elder in the group, I'm going to plead guilty to ageism. And what I mean by that, and this is why I love what you said, Connie, about internalized ageism. I realized that I do too many things. Somebody said the other day, Rick, how do you do all the things that you do? And I had to tell him a joke. I said, oh, by the way, there's really several. There's Rick Moody, there's Harry Moody, there's John Moody, there's all these different things. But this is not actually a good thing. And this is the paradox that I want to open up here, that I'm guilty of ageism because for me, and I worked for the guy who invented the term ageism, Robert Butler. Okay. So I thought to myself, I've spent all these years working against ageism, but actually I internalized it all along. And I'm so happy. I'm so committed. I'm so motivated to doing all these things. I'm not saying the elders should sit back in a rocking chair and not do anything. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we better start internalizing this and thinking about it. Otherwise, we're not going to make any progress with this struggle against ageism. By the way, when Ashton, when you were giving your talk, I was thinking to myself, I got nothing to say to this because I agree with everything that you said. I mean, so what am I supposed to do? Just press the mute button here and say, okay.
Let me respond, Rick.
Okay.
Let me respond because you're making a really profound point. And so for me, the shadow character that you're describing is called the doer.
The doer, that's it.
And when we identify and consciously identify with the doer, when we are what we do, we are our achievements, our productivity, our success, then we're living midlife values, when we're building empires, and it's appropriate at that stage of life. We're building family, we're building business, financial foundation. Then the doer helps us to achieve and fulfill the tasks, the developmental tasks of that stage of life. If we carry the doer into our 60s, 70s, and 80s, then what happens is a kind of damage to the soul because we don't slow down enough to contemplate. We don't slow down enough to do practices to take us within. Now, I'm not advocating for no doing. I don't want to make a split between doing and being or doing and meditation. What I'm suggesting is that the shift from role to soul is a shift in identity at the level of awareness. It's an unconscious identity that the doer, and we live in a workaholic culture.
We do.
So just like ageism, right? We're in this swimming in the workaholism. And so we're rewarded for all that we do. So this is about identity. a person who wants to become an elder has a certain amount of letting go, releasing the past, releasing outworn identities. And one of the identities is the doer. And so if you were to look at my life from the outside, I look like a massive doer because I'm writing and I'm teaching and I'm talking and I'm doing all this stuff. But internally, I have a very different experience and a different quality of awareness than I did in my 40s. Like when I published Romancing the Shadow, I had different values about being a writer and success. So today, that shift in identity from role to soul enables me to be aware that I am not what I do. That is not most deeply who I am. That's not my spiritual identity. And in day 5 on Friday, we're going to explore the spiritual purpose of age with some wonderful, renowned spiritual teachers. So my response is, yes, we can continue to be productive. We can continue to be activists, creatives. We can continue to contribute. But on the level of awareness, who am I? Who am I? Am I still my productivity, my success? Or am I something underneath everything that's changing? I'm not my body, right? I'm not my mind. And whatever language we use for it, whether we use spirit or soul or Buddha nature or Christ nature, whatever language we use, I used role to soul. I borrowed that phrase from Ram Dass, the spiritual teacher Ram Dass, because it so intuitively fits what I wanted to say. So so for you, I know how productive you are, and I'm in awe of how productive you are. And on another level, do you recognize that that's not who you are? That's the key for me.
I appreciate the correction. I really do. I'm monitoring the chat room now, and I've gotten a question here that says, can you talk about Gail Sheehy's Passages book? How does it play out with ageism? You're muted, Ashton, so why don't you unmute?
I'd like to speak to the productivity piece, and then I'm happy to talk about Gail Sheehy. I mean, I caught myself, I'm 70, and when I turned 65, I did indeed leave a paid job that I had, mainly because I got on Medicare to become a full-time activist. And I found myself being very judgmental about people who had retired. And I had to, it's like how it was hard for me to imagine that as a legitimate choice, which just shows how I too got sucked into that way of thinking. So I think it's that word productivity, it's really important to think about how we define it. I think it's the scholar Margaret Cruikshank who wrote a wonderful book called Learning to be Old. And again, you can find all these things, Becca Levy's book, all this stuff on Old School. That's the premise, one-stop shopping, right? For anything ageism related, right? So, and she says that older people can be involved in the hardest work of all, which Connie will have better language than I do, but of sort of integrating everything we have learned and coming to terms with our lives and the fact that they are, there's way less time ahead of us than behind. So I always want us to zoom out and look at where this message comes from. And I'm going to be the first person to say capitalism, which prioritizes busyness and productivity, typically defined in terms of, do you make money? If you don't make money, you are undervalued. And the pernicious way this is internalized is with older people framing themselves as a burden, not because they grow old, not because they ran out of money, not because they got sick, not simply because we grow old. And that is, and talking about suicide as the ethical alternative. And that is internalized ageism, literally of a lethal variety. That's what happens when we equate being conventionally productive with being a person of value in the world.
Yeah, very good. Very good. It's called Deaths from Despair, and it applies to many age groups. What about Gail Sheehy? I don't know if you ever met her or had a contact with her, read her. I think she's made a big contribution. How would you think about that, Ashton? Just curious. We've never talked about this, I realize.
No, and I have a sort of surface response, but I read her book. But Connie, let me go first because I don't think I have a terribly helpful answer. I always leery about dividing lifespans into fixed passages. Louise Aronson, who's a physician, wrote a fantastic book called Elderhood, talks about stage versus age and how older people can, and I think she's mainly talking in terms of physiological capacity, but we can get sick or encounter disability, and we can get better. We can vault ahead. And I don't even like that kind of binary language because it suggests that we can somehow keep going forever and that slowing down is bad. But in other words, there is not any one trajectory through life. So I think her book is terrific. It got people to look at the whole lifespan and the enrichment and value of every stage. But I also want to caution that, again, heterogeneity increases with age. The way we deal with this stuff is utterly individual, and that it's important not to think of it as something that we go through in fixed stages, just as the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's famous 5 stages of grief is being re-examined as something that some of us go through them, some of us go through some of them, some of us go through them in different order. So to always stress the absolute utter variability of how we deal with these things, and that variation increases with age.
So I would suggest that there are patterns to human development, and that there are stages. They may have cultural differences, they may have individual differences, but there are archetypal patterns to stages of life, and some people may not fit in them. But I think there's a way we can make some generalizations. We can say midlife and later life is sort of broad. And we can say that the developmental tasks of childhood, adolescence, midlife, and later life are really different. So, so our focus is on how is ageism affecting us from fulfilling the developmental tasks after 50, it may be 50 to 100. Because of the new longevity, we may be talking about a stage of life that's never been so long in the history of humanity, right? And so there's probably lots of substages. When we retire, it's a different stage. If we become ill, things change. If we lose a spouse, things change. But there are some developmental differences and tasks that change. And I say in my book that elder is a stage, not an age, because somebody can be 50 and yet have the quality of awareness I was describing, the kind of spiritual identity I was talking about, a connection to something greater than ego, a connection to shadow awareness, an awareness of mortality. And that person in her 50s, we could call an elder. But someone who's 85 may deny his age, may have become rigid and bitter and a black and white thinker, and have no connection to something beyond ego and no self-awareness. And so that person I call a senior. That person has not stepped into the archetype of the elder as a stage. It hasn't crossed that threshold to the new stage. So for me, Gail Sheehy opened up this field of developmental psychology to popular culture, and I'm grateful for that. But in my field of psychology, there's a massive amount of work about this. People could look at Erik Erikson, And after he died, his wife added another stage of later life to his model. So there's a lot of work about this that's really interesting.
We've had some great comments in the chat room, and I encourage people to read the chat. Unfortunately, I can't do it completely because I have to also be present. This is the challenge of multitasking. But some comments were made about Jane Fonda, who's now 84. And somebody said Gail Sheehy was my RV partner at Burning Man in 2015. So I wish, I regret that we can't have everybody who's on this call participating in one big room, but we'll find a way. Maybe the people who organize this can do it later on. Thoughts about illness and caregiving and so forth, because that has come out not just in terms of the fact that Jane Fonda is now undergoing cancer treatment, as well as become a huge spokesperson for environmental advocacy. So there's a kind of a duality here that on the one hand, there's losses and threats, but on the other hand, there's what some would call outliving the self. So I just wonder if our two ladies, if I may call you that, can comment on caregiving. The reality is that women are much more involved in caregiving than men typically. There are differences, of course, but your thoughts on this and how it connects with the struggle against ageism.
I'll go first and make it short. Caring for people is an important, beautiful, gorgeous part of being human. And these are not one-way transactions. I was at a conference long ago and someone said, how many people like to help people? And everyone raised their hand. And then how many people like to receive help? And everyone dove under their chairs.
Right.
Because of shame, because of this valorization, which is especially American and so toxic about how, as though we're independent to the end, which is my point about asking for help.
Yeah.
What makes caring a burden is going it alone without support. So we need to look at the structures that enable caregiving to be neglected, to be underpaid. Those structural forces are sexism. It is highly gendered. One of the reasons women are much more likely to end up in poverty in later life is because we're paid less lifelong. And I'm happy to talk about that till the cows come home, but I won't, Connie. And also the fact that most of it is done by, in the US, women of color, many of whom are not, legal citizens. So racism enters into that, and classism. We need to look at the structures that devalue. If you think about it, what is more important than caring for the people we love? Our parents, our children, and I don't want to reduce it to just biological family at all, ever. And yet we don't value this work under a patriarchy and capitalism.
Yes, so beautiful description of caregiving from the outside in and the social institutional changes that we really desperately need to happen with the aging of the population. I'm going to comment on it from the inside out, because that seems to be our collaboration today. I also want to point out that, Rick, there is an after chat here. Hold on, there's an after chat where you can join in. Somebody posted that we can join in conversation with our listeners afterwards. And there's a link in the chat to be able to do that.
Great. Thank you very much.
So in my chapter on illness and caregiving, I really wanted to explore this experience from the inside out. What happens emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, when we become ill, when a loved one becomes ill, and we need to take care of him or her? And one of the stories I told was that one of my closest friends was dying of cancer while I was writing the book. And I would spend a few hours writing, and then I would drive down the mountain and spend a few hours with her. And it was a very intense period of time for me. Her family did not show up, and her friends have always been her family. She never married or had kids. And so many friends showed up, and I took over certain aspects of running her life. And we began to discover that she, for the first time in many decades, we would trigger each other. We would emotionally feel charged with each other as I had to pay her bills, do a whole bunch of practical things, write her trust, make serious decisions. So we began to do shadow work together. We began to identify what was coming up in each of us that was sabotaging our openness, that was stopping us from being as kind and as patient as we could be with each other. And it opened out into this profound exchange over many months until we became really transparent to each other. And I felt that our friendship made this shift out of the role of patient and caregiver into a soul-to-soul friendship. It wasn't easy. It took energy. It took self-awareness. It took transparency. But it was really caregiving from the inside out. And I miss her to this day. It was such a beautiful friendship. And at the same time, it was an incredible gift that I could experience that she could experience that while I was writing this book, so that I could transmit it to you, to the readers. So there is a way that we can carry our inner work into being ill. My husband has had a serious diagnosis, and so I'm moving again into this role slowly now, not quickly. And he and I are doing this inner work as we make this transition. So, and again, some of it, as you mentioned, Ashton, is about grief and working with our grief, but some of it is also maintaining our spiritual practice, remembering who we deeply are, who I am, who he is, you know. Not the body, not the story, not the mind, not the pain in the moment, you know, that there is a deeper identity that is available to us, even in these really, really difficult moments.
Ashton, I wonder if you could say something about how that inner dimension can help or hinder activism. I'm part of a group called Resilient Activists, and that's something that I think we need to ponder, the challenge of burnout and anger, self-righteousness, some of these kind of issues that come up. What are your thoughts on that?
What comes to my mind is, I didn't even say this word in my brief remarks. I hope they felt brief. Which is denial. You know, ageism sinks its claws into us, as Connie mentioned, in this denial where we're gonna get old, we might even be old. And a metaphor that comes to mind is this hamster wheel where we get on it, you know, and we are so hard at work, struggling to work and move and look like younger versions of ourselves, which is impossible. I love the way that the geriatrician Bill Thomas frames it as the tyranny of still. As long as we're still, fill in the blank, driving at night, dating younger women, running up the stairs. And we all have our stills and they're precious to us, no judgment, you know, but why do we stop celebrating the ability to adapt and change and grow as we move through life, which I think Connie talks about much more eloquently than I do. That is exhausting. So, you know, I'm giving a typically outside in answer, but
no, that's good. That's good. That's good.
If we can step off this hamster wheel of age denial, simply, I call it, it's a phrase I had adopted from geriatrician Joanne Lynn, becoming an old person in training. And the younger in life we can do it, the earlier, the better, and make an emotional connection, of just an imaginative leap to our older selves and be like, I'm going to get old. It can be as far off, older you can be as far off as you need her to be. But then we're not investing all this energy in a pursuit that divides us and alienates us and pits us against each other.
Yeah.
So, you know, Rick, this division between the inner world and the outer world is a false split that we make in our culture. What is an elder activist who knows that activism is not his or her identity, is not that the doing of activism, the contribution to social justice work, to climate work, to intergenerational work, is not who I am. I want to do it. Tomorrow, our whole event is about elder activist organizations. We have Bill McKibben on climate. We have Lynn Iser on Elders Action Network. We have all these great elder activists tomorrow. But I want to make the point that we can continue to be activists. You know, when I think about when I was an activist in my 20s at UC Berkeley, a lot of my activism was about projecting my own anger. And if I really look at it psychologically, where that anger came from and what were the causes I was joining and what was I projecting it onto? And what is my activism sourced in now? For me, it's much more from grief. So how does that shape my experience of activism and my contributions to the communities I'm engaged with? I've been a climate activist for decades now. How is that shaped by my knowing that I'm not the doer? And
those, you know, I gave a talk a couple of years ago to a seniors group about climate change, and I was very proud of my, you know, I did a good job, had great slides and examples. And afterwards, I was walking out, and an older woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, Dr. Moody," they call me Dr. Moody when I give things like that. "I found your talk so informative." And then she said, "I'm glad I'm not going to live to see it." And I thought to myself later on, I was thinking to myself, what's this all about? Am I communicating a message of despair, of hopelessness? It's worse than you think kind of stuff. And I realized I better somehow figure out a different way of talking, a way that Rebecca Solnit, who has a great book on this called Hope in the Dark, somehow a version of hope, which is not wish fulfillment or technology will save us or the young people are going to work on it. I think the elders need to have a role in this too. They can't just say, and I say this as the token elder here in our group, I may not be around to see it. Well, I think about my little granddaughters. They're going to be around to see it. Maybe that's the way that we have to frame it. I'm working this out right now. I'm trying to write a book.
Yes, I had the same experience when I trained with Al Gore several decades ago.
And what was that experience?
Well, he was so catastrophic in his descriptions, and he wanted us to go out and do these catastrophic slideshows. And I did a couple of them and just found that was completely wrong strategy. It just generated fear. It didn't motivate. It didn't motivate people. It created despair.
Yeah.
So that's a distinction we can make as elder activists to attune to our listeners, to attune to our audience.
I think so.
Rather than carry a self-righteous sort of egomaniacal message like we did in our youth when we thought we were right and they were wrong.
Yeah.
It's a very different quality of activism to be attuned and collaborative and bring our whole life experience of what works into our social justice work.
How does this play out, Ashton? You said something very interesting a few minutes ago. You said when you turned 65 and you got Medicare, and then you said, but you kind of looked down or looked badly at people who said that they were retired. Did I hear that correctly? You know, that you had a negative attitude?
I'm embarrassed to say yes. I mean, I have to say one of my best teachers in this practice that I am working at being less judgmental is my son, who's, 35. One of the best pieces of advice I got when I was writing my manifesto was don't use the word should. I used to be preachier about women who, dyed their hair to cover the gray or fudged their resumes and whatever. And a woman, this is embarrassing, but a woman came up to me and said, "You don't get it. If I didn't dye my hair, my boss would fire me, and I have children to support." So
she was right. She was right.
Absolutely right. I was chastened as I should have been. And I think where it plays out in aging in particular is this. I sort of sometimes think like if I could implant one fact in the skulls of the world, it would be that the longer we age, the more different from one another we become, the less our age reveals about us, and that each person has to navigate this stuff in their own way, at their own speed. And I have to say, I also see this as gendered. It was Rebecca Solnit who invented the term mansplaining she wrote a book, sorry. She wrote a fantastic book called Men Explain Things to Me, catalyzed by she was at a cocktail party and this guy insisted on telling her all about the book he had just read.
It's a great story.
Finally, like 15 minutes, and she's like, "I wrote that book." I do see
it's a great story
as gendered because there's so many voices, women's more than men, telling us women what we should look like, what we should wear, how we should behave, and I don't want to be one of them.
Yeah. Right.
And I think, one of the freedoms of being old, I have 73 years of life experience. One of the freedoms is no shoulds. There's an incredible liberation that comes with that. A freedom to be more authentic, to be more, it's not a freedom to be judgmental as you were struggling with. And I've struggled with that as well. For many years, I've done shadow work on this part of me that I call the judge. But now, today, there's a freedom from right and wrong. There's a freedom from, no, that's not accurate either, because with the political dangers that are happening now, we can't really say there's no right and wrong. I wish I could say that. But with democracy at stake, we can't say that. There's a freedom from obligation, so we don't want to say elders are obligated to engage as activists or elders are obligated to meditate. We don't want to frame it that way because the shoulds in earlier stages of life may have been appropriate for some people at some times. But today, as elders, I think part of it is there's a freedom to be ourselves, to be as authentic as we can be. And again, that may be different for different people, partly because we're at different stages in psychological development, partly we have different beliefs, but there's that freedom. And so for me, I really agree with you that the shoulds gotta go.
I had a great question in the chat room from Ina Albert. I am 87, but how do I respond when people compliment me and say, gee, you don't look that way, kind of thing? I mean, it's related to what we're talking about, isn't it?
I have the only snappy answer I've come up with when people say you look great for your age. Say
that's
you look
it.
Great for your age too. And people have to think about why what they intended as a compliment doesn't feel like a compliment. And that is the moment of reflection in which it is uncomfortable. So we have to screw up our courage instead of saying, oh, thanks so much. But for one thing, what age could we look besides our own? And this is how 70 looks on me, and it looks totally different on someone else. And also, if we are lucky enough to look what someone thinks is good, it's as much a function of luck and privilege as anything else. So, and I want to make the case that if we say nothing changes. And it's also really, really hard to think of the snappy thing to say in the moment. I learned this phrase from another fabulous age scholar, Margaret Galette. You can find her books on Old School. She said that the esprit de l'escalier, the spirit of the stairs, the perfect answer, retort you come up with as you were on the stairs leaving the event. But a really good all-purpose rejoinder to an ageist comment is, what do you mean by that?
Mhm.
Said in a really neutral way, you know, you don't want to blame or shame. Your goal is just to confront, but in a calm, neutral, not because the minute someone gets on the defensive, the battle is lost. Just as the minute someone is despairing, they're not able to engage. You want to make a space where the person can reflect on what they said, because most bias is unconscious. People may mean it in the best of ways, but intention doesn't let you off the hook. And it's, if we want to change the way the world thinks about aging, it is incumbent on us to challenge people gently and kindly when we encounter it.
I like that.
People say or do.
I like that. One of our commentators in the chat room said, this is Carol Sue Engelman, said, I say this is what 70 is supposed to look like. So I thought
It's
that was
what it looks like on you. There's no supposed. Respectfully, there is no supposed.
So is there anything else in the chat we want to respond to?
There's a comment about genes that, and I learned this from Robert Butler also, who invented the term ageism, and I've seen it corroborated. Genes are responsible for much less of our health outcomes than we think they are, 1/3 to 1/4. Consciousness, on the other hand, as we are hearing from Connie and we'll hear throughout the week, has an awful lot to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Jim. Any thoughts?
Well, I've been just marveling at this conversation and all the points that you're all raising. They're very, very deep and very challenging, you know, and I wanted to just pick up on a couple of points. One that you made at the beginning, Harry, and would love Connie and Ashton, your perspective, this extraordinary differential in how men and women age, and the fact that globally, men don't age as well as women and die younger than women do. You know, so this raises in my mind the whole issue of aging and gender. And I would just wonder what comments that you would have on this matter of men not living as long as women, and why that happens.
A useful factoid: those with the Y chromosome, that's you and me, Jim, have a higher death rate at every age, even before birth, than females. And conversely, women are more susceptible to immune diseases, and it may have something to do with the double X. There's a lot that's unknown about this. And it's very hard, and I think Ashton made this point too, it's very hard to sort out what's genetic and what's environmental, what we can change, and what we're responsible for, either collectively or individually. The one thing I think that is clear is that we need, as we get older, need to be thinking about our legacy. And I'd like to turn a question to you, since you're part of the conversation now, Jim, and I know you had occasion to be in contact with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was retired, let us say, involuntarily at a certain point in his life, and yet in his later years also tried to continue to be productive and was very concerned about his legacy, as we all are now about Russia. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
On Mikhail Gorbachev?
On the question of legacy work and aging among societies, because in our pre-talk, before we actually went live you mentioned all these societies around the world are aging demographically. And we've been here talking today mostly about individual aging and how we struggle with collective representations. But how does this play out? That's why I gave the example of Gorbachev, and you knew him and worked with him.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. You know, I'm 71. I've been the chief executive of the university since 2005. I've been thinking about legacy. I've been thinking about transition. I've been thinking about how, and this, you know, I realize, Ashton, your clear point that it's not about age, it's about competency. And yet I also think, you know, the Hindus had it right that there are 4 stages of life, and that you get to a stage where you feel it's time to go into the forest, and that tends to be at this later stage. I think, you know, when one enters one's 70s, one begins to become more aware of one's inevitable mortality. And I think that that's one of the characteristics of the aging, eldering process that focuses us on some of the issues, Connie, that you were raising. We realize what we didn't know when we were young, that we're not immortal.
Right.
I have 2 sons in their 30s. They still believe that they're immortal.
Right.
They act like it. They party like it. They speak like it, and are humorously entertained at Claire and I when we talk about, you know, that we're looking at it a little bit differently now.
Right.
And so I think that's another, I don't want to call it ageism, but I want to call it the, you know, as the Desiderata says, you know, surrender gracefully the things that are youth. And that's when, for me, Rick, that's when legacy, you start to think about.
I'm laughing because you're already in the forest. I see it in their background. See all those trees.
You know,
hypothesis about why women live longer, because we have illnesses as well, and the medical establishment does not understand why we live longer. But one of the many things that surprised me, everything surprised me in the beginning, I was a complete skeptic about all of this, was that the most important component of a good old age, this is from a sort of Western conventional point of view, but is not, I would have thought it was health. My second guess was wealth, because I thought, well, then you can buy the things that enable a good old age. It's not neither of those things. It's having a solid social network. And women and men are impoverished by this, but we tend to be, it's one of the benefits of having this burden of unassisted caregiving, you know, the too much of the burden.
Yeah.
We are the custodians of networks. We talk to each other more. We talk about intimate things more. And I think that there's certainly a factor. I don't know whether there's never a single factor, but I think
that's a factor. You're right. You're right. It's true.
Yes. Social isolation and social support.
Do you have a theory, Connie? Why women live longer?
I think toxic masculinity is really hard on men. I think there's a way in which men carry patriarchal
I agree. Justice
obligations
is horrible for white people.
Yes.
All oppression denies us our full humanity. It's all bad for all of us.
Yes. So male supremacy is bad for male health. And I also, you know, read that older men have higher rates of suicide than younger men. Than older women. Older men have higher rates of suicide than older women. So why is that? I mean, it's a really disturbing statistic. I think some of it is the social isolation we were just referencing. Not having learned certain social and emotional skills, intimacy skills, and the shame of losing the identity of the doer or the provider. So many, many men in my interviews said to me, if I'm not the provider, who am I? And that's really
back to productivity, to find your value in terms of your money earning capacity. It's such a limited understanding.
Right. And so it's a heavy burden for men to carry. Women are sharing that much more now, the provider identity. But in the past, that it's been a heavy burden, I think, for men in postmodern Western culture. It's not universal. But I wanted to also return to legacy. I think there's an important question that we can all contemplate at any age, which is, what is the gift that only I can give? And to really allow that to guide you in your life, to guide you to purpose, to guide you to career, to guide you to later life contribution. You know, when I saw that there was when I was in my late 60s and I started to feel disoriented, I started looking for books about the unconscious and aging, about the shadows of age. There wasn't one.
You're right. You're
There
right.
wasn't one. And I thought, oh my God, I have to write another book, because who else is going to do, right? Who else is going to write on the shadows of age?
There weren't any books about the outer work of it either. I just want to point out.
Well, there are lots of books about the institutional challenges, you know, healthcare and aging, education, workplace and aging and stuff. But there was nothing about the shadow. So what is the gift that only you can give? Seems to me it will orient you to legacy, whoever you are.
You know, I had the great privilege when I lived in Boulder, Colorado, to get to know Reb Zalman Schachter, who wrote a great book, From Aging to Saging. And I was with Reb Zalman one time. This is about 30 years ago, when he's now deceased and I was younger. And we're in a restaurant, and he said, this aging business, he said, it's really very simple. The only question is, are you saved? And I thought, well, he's a theologian, a rabbi. He says, no, I don't mean it in a religious sense. I mean it in a computer sense. Are you saved? Have you downloaded your life experience for the next generation? Are you doing your legacy work? And Reb Zalman was deeply preoccupied. In fact, there's a whole Reb Zalman legacy project that people who were influenced by him have carried out. But all of us have to start doing our legacy work, even younger than when we're, quote, old. And I just think that's something that needs to be talked about, and it's not talked about enough.
Yeah, you know, and I want to bring in a point that Stan Pokris has made in the chat, that he says, I prefer to avoid worrying about aging and keep on thinking and working on being a curious being. Curiosity is the actual driving force in the universe, and we all need to be more helpful to each other. Helpfulness brings people into focus.
He's right.
And I think that's actually quite a profound insight, Stan, about curiosity and helpfulness. And I think, you know, as we age, I think we begin to honor those virtues more deeply, and that brings the vitality, Ashton, that I think you're encouraging everyone to embody, rather than focusing on chronology, focusing on the inner characteristics of a meaningful life, and allow that to inform aging, because I forget who said it, to live is to age.
I think, I
That's
read
just the bottom line.
That's my hat.
Yeah.
Aging is living.
Yeah. Keep that hat on, man.
Even I wonder, just to be contrarian, the notion of vitality, and actually, Connie, here is where I can learn again from you. I think there's something about vitality that equals in our consciousness youthfulness or energy, all those code words for young, and that you can be in a meditative posture and be completely quiet and contemplative, which does not seem vitality oriented, and it's absolutely utterly legitimate as well.
Yes,
Absolutely.
we can be crawling around on the floor with our grandkids, right?
We're sitting in the porch swing.
Reconnecting with our own inner child, playful, curious, innocent even, and remembering, recalling, reliving that part of ourselves, even in our older bodies. Every age we've ever been is alive in us now. Every age we've ever been.
That's the epigraph to my book is a quote of Anne Lamott's. And I've heard it from poets and other people. We contain all the ages we have ever been. We don't
Yes.
wake up old and everything's gone to hell. Those selves remain. And that's why people don't actually want to be younger. That, like, I put it out there as a thought experiment. Everyone's face lightens up and then they go, oh crap, there's a catch, isn't there? I don't get to, just have everything I know in a more, healthy, less crumbly body. No, you don't.
Wendy Lustbader, whose book I held up actually, and I really commend her to her. I've had a chance to get to know her personally, and she said she was sort of a mentor or a leader of a youth group one time, going around Australia, wherever it was, and there were these young people who were so miserable and in turmoil, and she said to them, don't worry, she said, these are the worst years of your life. And I had to laugh at that because I'm a Yale graduate and we have our theme song is Bright College Years with Pleasure Rife, the shortest, gladdest years of life. And she was saying exactly the opposite.
Being young is hard. That's another reason to mix it up age-wise, socially, if you can, to be reminded.
It was
what's that
how
saying?
hard it is to be young.
Yeah.
Youth is wasted on the young.
Yes. Right.
Well, not wasted. I mean, that's not wasted, of course, but we all have to learn this stuff the hard way.
Yeah.
So I recognize that we're out of time, and I want to open a couple of invitations to everyone who's listening. Tomorrow, day 2 of the Inner Work of Age, we're going to have What Can One Person Do? The Moral Voice of the Elder. And you'll be meeting with the heads of several elder activist organizations to hear how you can contribute to the common good, how you can engage whatever cause you're passionate about.
Yeah, they're great people.
Yeah, I
Having
also
a purpose, tons of research on purpose and how it contributes to a good old age. And again, I want to say purpose can be to finish a novel, reading it, not writing it.
Thank you.
A really
very good point.
You don't have to aspire to change the world or learn how to do it all right. Every little thing you do to reconfigure your own attitude to aging to a more realistic one ripples
Very
out.
good.
okay.
Taking away my guilt.
The second invitation is, if you would like to read The Inner Work of Age in community, there are about 50 what I call wisdom circles now, reading the book together. They're online, they're free. They have rotating facilitators. If you're interested in a wisdom circle to do the practices, each chapter in the book has practices to do that with other people and kind of walk through this experience together. You can shoot me an email, conniezweig@gmail.com, put wisdom circle in the subject line, and I will connect you with other people.
Fantastic.
And the last invitation is I'm hosting a 3-day conference on the Inner Work of Age online with Pacifica Graduate Institute. Ken Wilber, Jean Shinoda Bolin, and Bill McKibben will be doing the keynotes. And this conference has continuing ed credits available. So if you're interested in that, I'll put you can find it at retreat.pacifica.edu. And I will put that in the chat for you. Thank you, everybody, so much. This was really fun.
It was great.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Ashton. That brings our session to a close. You'll all find the link to the after session chat group just posted in the chat. And Ashton and Rick and Connie, you got the link in the Zoom invite that you received for this call. So we would very much welcome you to join us. And I just want to finish. I think, Ashton, you called it by saying that purpose while we age may be just finishing the novel, not writing it. I think that's
great.
That's a little koan worth contemplating. And I love your hat, Rick. I think there's deep wisdom in that, hat that to live is to age. That's why we age, is because we're living. And as we're
Yes.
living, we're aging.
Yes.
And that's the most natural process in the world. And it's full of vitality, curiosity, love, compassion, and purpose each step of the way. And that's the beauty of our lives. So thank you so much, all three of you, for this beautiful opening, Connie. Thank you so much. And we're looking forward till tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.